Hello and welcome everyone. I hope, can you hear me okay? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank you, Amanda. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for deciding to join us today as we learn more about balancing pollinator conservation with pesticide application using IPM. My name is Beth Thomas, and I am the Training and Development Specialist for the Montana Department of Agriculture. So before we begin, I do have a couple of housekeeping items for you. First of all, I know a lot of you are looking to earn credit for this particular webinar. And so when you're asked, Lori Leaf, our education outreach person, is going to be typing in the chat and she'll ask you in the chat. So only when she asks you, please use the chat box, which is circled in red, and enter your first and last name as well as your license number. There will be several checks throughout the webinar, and you must be present for the full webinar in order to earn the credit. If you see your license number and your first and last name, then we see it too. If you are not a pest applicator, please feel free to sit back, relax, and enjoy. Questions. There is an opportunity for questions by using the Q&A box. Our panelists from the Pesticide Education Department will address those throughout the webinar, but actually they'll monitor them and then Amanda will answer them at the end of the webinar. And those panelists from the Montana Department of Agriculture that'll be helping with that are Lori Leaf and Stephen Van Tassel. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is Amanda's contact information will be available for you at the end. It'll be her last slide. For those of you that are curious about earning credits and which categories, here is that list that shows which categories will earn the 1 credit. All right, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Amanda Bachman. Amanda is the Urban Entomology Field Specialist with South Dakota State University Extension, and she's based in Pierre, South Dakota. She has a PhD in entomology from Penn State. She as an urban entomologist, she works not only with the traditional urban pests like bed bugs and mosquitoes, but also urban pollinators and other beneficial insects, as well as helping specialty crop producers with insect issues. She is an executive committee member for the South Dakota Volunteer Naturalists and also serves as the past president of the American Association of Pesticide Safety Educators. Without further ado, Amanda, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. I will go ahead and share my screen here. All right, I think we should be good. And yeah, I'm going to be talking today about balancing pollinator conservation with pesticide application using IPM. And yeah, I'm out here in South Dakota. I am originally from Pennsylvania, and I was just thinking about it as you were reading the introduction, and I'm like, I don't think I've actually ever been to Montana. So I will have to change that at some point. But yeah, I've been out here for about 12 years almost in South Dakota. And today we're going to talk about some pollinators and pollination services. So a little bit of a crash course in who these insects are. I'm going to talk about FieldWatch, which is an application that is used nationwide in quite a few states. South Dakota uses it, and Montana does as well. And then I'm going to give you guys the real crash course in the basics of integrated pest management, as well as how to use IPM to minimize pesticide impacts on pollinators. And I will hopefully, I've got my cell phone in front of me so I can see the time, but I will try to leave some time for questions at the end. I'll handle any content questions at the very end. If you have questions about your Montana pesticide license or anything like that, your Montana Department of Ag folks will handle those questions sort of maybe while I'm talking, but we'll do content questions at the end. But yeah, one of the big questions here is, can pollinators and pesticides coexist? And really, in our agricultural landscape, they have to. Pesticides are a tool in the toolbox for pest management, and we have a lot of critters out there that act as pollinators. And so we're going to talk about some of the ways that we can make sure that they can continue to coexist well. So who are the pollinators? Usually, first thing people think is bees, but there are more than just bees, and there's more bees than just honeybees. Honeybees obviously get a lot of press, and we'll talk about those in a little bit, but we also have bumblebees and numerous species of other bees, some of which you might not even recognize as actually being a bee. We also have flies, butterflies, beetles, and some non-insect pollinators, which include birds and bats. Those can be a little bit more tropical in distribution. We don't really worry too much about bird pollinators in, places like South Dakota. But you can see that it's not just insects that are serving as pollinators, and it's of the insects, it's not just bees that are serving as pollinators. So while a lot of the recommendations and advice that are out there are focusing on bees, you do want to be wary of the other insects that are out there in your fields. And as an entomologist, those are some of the critters that I spend a lot of time with. But our bees, we have our native bee species. Bumblebees are native to the US. We have, I think in South Dakota, we've got about 25 species of bumblebees. There's a project called the Bumblebee Atlas. And I actually should have checked to see if it goes into Montana, but they have some really great identification guides to bumblebees if those are a critter that spark your interest. We also have a number of solitary bee species. I think we've got about 500 of those species in South Dakota. I imagine Montana is similarly, if not more diverse, because you guys have a much larger geographic scope and some more altitude and elevation than we have here in South Dakota. I mean, we've got the Black Hills, but I think you guys have some more impressive mountains. But those solitary bees are really interesting because they're not managed by people. They can have sort of more cryptic life cycles. They might be active for only a few weeks out of the year. They could be ground nesting or cavity nesting and harder to find and sort of monitor. So those are some of the bees that we really don't know all of the impacts we have on them because we just don't have the same amount of data we do on things that are managed, like our honeybees. The picture is of a bumblebee, um, but honeybees are managed like tiny little livestock. And bees in Montana, I did look this stuff up because I had this slide for South Dakota. And South Dakota is one of the major honeybee and honey producing states in the nation, and Montana is as well. So you guys are in the top 5 nationally in honey production. As a state, you also have a managed pollinator protection plan. Many states that have EPA, certified certification and training programs have managed pollinator protection plans. That was something that they kind of started putting in place back in the 2015-ish era. But we've got one in South Dakota too, and that really covers advice on managed pollinators. So those are going to be your honeybees predominantly, but there are some other bee species that can fall under managed, like some orchard bees and some mason bees, but it is predominantly honeybees. And then I did look up, and you guys do have an apiary search on your Montana Plants website. South Dakota also has a way to track apiaries. They have to be registered with the state. I'm not sure if that's a similar requirement to Montana, but based on what I saw on some of your maps, I'm guessing it might be. But yeah, honeybees specifically are a big business out here in the north central region, in the high plains, and moving out west. But pollinators absolutely need stakeholder support in order for any of the conservation efforts to work. I work a lot with folks who are looking to add pollinator habitat either to private property, to municipal property, or in natural areas. I've done some pollinator gardening in my yard and gotten some angry letters from neighbors. So I understand some of the issues. Um, but you also have to factor in that as you're creating habitat, what are the pests that are going to be moving in? Are you creating sort of like a weed issue for yourself? Like what's happening? And then also having realistic expectations with stakeholders that are involved in pollinator conservation and even pesticide application. You're really never going to get to a zero pest population. Perhaps maybe unless you're in a structural situation and you're trying to get like bed bugs out of a place. But outside in the natural world, you're never going to end up with no pests ever. And of course, pest covers more than just insects. Obviously, plants can be pests. Weeds are, and weed management are a big issue. But I will be focusing mostly sort of on the insect side of things today. However, the integrated pest management principles do cover all critters, all pest issues. They work for plant diseases, they work for weeds, they work for mammals. It's not just something that is for insects. So, pollinators on pesticide labels. Obviously, pesticide labels, great reading, super thrilling. Um, just kidding. They're usually fairly long and have tiny font, but they're very important documents. I highly recommend that for all the products that you might be using in your operation, that you make sure to pull up the most recent PDF label because that allows you to use the search function in your PDF reader application to like find some of the sections, find some of the terms, and it might, you can just control F and be like bees and easily see what your label says about bees. But EPA, probably over maybe not quite 10 years ago at this point, maybe a little bit longer, but they added a bee advisory box to certain products. So you'll find these mostly on insecticides, and of those insecticides, it's going to be mostly on neonicotinoid products. And so these boxes include additional application restrictions for those products. And you can see it has like the cute little icon of a honeybee. So again, most of these restrictions are using like with honeybees in mind because that is usually the bee that is out there, especially if you're in specialty crops or areas where you have apiaries and honeybee hives nearby. So this bee advisory box is going to tell you if there's additional like application restrictions as far as like buffer zones, any sort of reentry interval issues, lots of information. Um, Lots of information on a label. I did pesticide education for 9 years, and I think there was nary a presentation that went by without one of us saying, make sure to read and follow those label directions. So that also counts with pollinators as well. And again, take a look at your labels. Now's a great time. It's cold here in South Dakota. I'm sure it's been cold in Montana, but unless you're sort of out hunting, it's a great time to be indoors and maybe refreshing those labels in your pesticide label binder and taking a second look to see if any of them have additional restrictions where pollinators are concerned. So for some best stewardship practices, minimizing spray drift is super important. It's important for a lot of reasons, but it also helps out the pollinators. So making sure that you've got appropriate buffers, that you're checking the weather forecast, and that you're choosing appropriate nozzles for the application, minimizing your vapor drift, and then being aware of the flowering crops and plants that are adjacent to application areas. I was sort of refreshing some of my knowledge and watching some recordings of other webinars. And, if you are an applicator who is also the farm operator, one thing that you can do to minimize the impact of pesticides to pollinators is if you've got flowering weeds and you can mow those before a pesticide application, like go ahead and mow those weeds because removing that flower resource will also remove pollinators from like visiting that area when you're doing the application. A lot of times homeowners will ask me questions about, garden pests and they're like, well, what can I spray? And I'm like, well, if anything is flowering in your garden, like you really can't spray a whole lot of things and not have an impact on, your fruit set or your crop yield. So, keep in mind that if there's flowers in the environment, you're going to have pollinators visiting. So a tool that's really helpful for determining, say, where you've got those flowering crops is FieldWatch. And I'm going to take a brief break, drink some water. But FieldWatch is super handy. I've hopped in there sort of as an educator, but I'm not a producer, so I haven't, had to use it in that capacity. But this is something that is available nationwide. There's probably upwards of 25 states at this point that participate in FieldWatch. South Dakota hopped on, maybe about 5 years ago. Before that, we had a like state-specific thing application that did kind of the same thing as FieldWatch, but it was not as equipped to handle sort of the volume of beehives that had to be registered. But FieldWatch shows you specialty crops, beehives. It's kind of only as good as the people participating. So we have been doing an education push for FieldWatch, especially in South Dakota over the past couple of years, because we do want more of our pesticide applicators to make sure that they're signing up for FieldWatch so they can utilize the information. As far as the growers side of FieldWatch, I've seen the FieldWatch folks at numerous like ag meetings advertising their services, which are free, and it's a voluntary program. So this isn't required by anybody's Department of Ag, but it is a really useful tool. You can access it on the web, and you can also access it via app. So I'll show you the website, and you can see that Field Check by FieldWatch is the app there. But yeah, that's the link for the Montana page. So I I did bop over and get some screenshots of Montana, but some of the stuff I'm going to walk through, I'm using South Dakota screenshots because I couldn't log in. I didn't want to set up an account as a pretend I was in Montana. But when you go to the FieldWatch website, if you're an applicator, there's an area, and you can see the red arrow, field check for applicators, and that would be the part of the application that you would be using. So in South Dakota, and I am sure also for Montana as well, when you register as an applicator, you can sign up for site alerts. So you can tell FieldWatch, like, hey, send me an email when there's any changes in my application area. So you can either, draw that yourself, or you can, click off a bunch of counties. You can see here, this is what it would look like for South Dakota. You can see our South Dakota counties, but that allows you to know anytime there's maybe a new sensitive site registered in your application area, if there's maybe changes to a sensitive site that already exists. And if you're somebody who applies across the entire state, you can just check the entire state. Or you can, like I said, draw a custom region on the map. So it's a really useful tool. We definitely want more people to be participating in it. In South Dakota, they'll send emails for every new site that's registered in your area. Beekeepers can mark their hives as private. So in South Dakota, beekeepers have to register their apiaries with the South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources. But they can mark those as private so that you have to be logged in order to see all of their contact information. But yeah, it's super handy, and you can see that the national map, um, and this is just crops, not apiaries, because if you included apiaries, it would just be a sea of red. But you can see that there's a ton of participation in the Midwest, especially when you get east of the Mississippi and they actually get rainfall. Lots of specialty crops and like various organic production and all sorts of stuff happening out there. You can see a couple flags there in Montana. I'll show you some closer up views of Montana here in a little bit. And you can see South Dakota, we've got some increasing participation as well. But yeah, and the states that don't have any, like your Californias, your Nevadas, your Utahs, I don't believe they currently participate in the program. But yeah, South Dakota, we've got about 800 specialty crop producers on there. And you can see since beehives have to be registered, it's just like the whole state filled in with beehives. So we have almost 7,500 beehives in there. For Montana, here's your beehives. I was having a good time sort of like flipping through trying to figure out what would give the most useful image. But you can see also loads of apiaries in your state. If you are a pesticide applicator, get yourself into FieldWatch so that you can see in your application area what beehives you might be contending with. It's also kind of handy too because I know apiaries can like move around during the season, and um, those details might not be reflected in FieldWatch, but at least you'll sort of have like the last known location or at least the contact information for the beekeeper to be able to, get in touch with them to be like, hey, can you move hives? Can you shut the bees in? Here's what's happening. And like I said, it's not just for bees. It also covers specialty crops. In in Montana, you guys don't have as many specialty crop producers participating yet. Um, it looked like a lot of, I think the ends were nursery crops. Um, but those are also available on the map. It helps to toggle off beehives because then you can actually see those other specialty crops. But once you click on one of those little flags on the map, you'll see the site information. And this one is an example. Thank you to the South Dakota Department of Ag for putting together these screenshots. But say you click on that beehive, it will give you the producer's name, their email, their address. So this is why some of that information is only available to registered site users. Otherwise, people have a whole lot out there on the internet. But that gives you contact information for the folks. So as an applicator, you can get in touch with them to, do some best practices there, maybe as far as like mitigating drift onto their bees. And the specialty crop site's very similar. It's just, the different flag that doesn't say bee. But you can again see that you would have the contact information for that producer as well as sort of the field details for that area. So hopefully I've sold some of you on FieldWatch if you aren't already using it. It is real handy. It's a decent app to use. I like messing around with it on the computer just because you can really like zoom in, but I know a lot of folks really just primarily use a smartphone. And like I said, there is an app available as well. So moving on from FieldWatch, is pest management possible without using chemicals first? It absolutely is possible. And this is what we call integrated pest management. So it's a sustainable approach where we're combining prevention, avoidance, monitoring, and suppression as a way to minimize economic, health, and environmental risks. So as we go through this crash course in IPM, for those of you that are pesticide applicators, I know that you might not be the person at every step of this like cycle. If you're not the person who owns the crop, you're just doing an application, like that's cool. Um, but for those of you who are maybe an applicator as well as a producer, you are the people that are going to be sort of involved in all of the steps in this process. And if you're somebody out there watching who is a producer, but you don't do your own pesticide applications, you're going to be the person for a lot of this cycle. And maybe this will help you to better target some of your pesticide application decisions. So, like I said, it's a cycle. It's not just a go through a list of a checklist and then you're done. Um, but it does start with pest identification. So once you have that pest identified, you got to monitor it. So you're looking at, what are our population trends over time? Um, Looking at management recommendations, which can be state and crop specific. So, South Dakota side, we have SDSU Extension. Montana side, you guys have Montana State Extension. Um, and then as far as management strategies, we're using multiple ones. Hopefully, that's the goal. So we don't want to just be using insecticides or pesticides, the whole umbrella term, your insecticides, your herbicides, your rodenticides, your all the sides. Um, We don't want to just be using pesticides because we have resistance issues. They're expensive, they can be time consuming. And there's other management strategies that can hopefully get us to a place where we can really target those pesticide applications and use them very judiciously. But identification is a really big one. I know in South Dakota, we've got folks who are, agronomists. They're out there doing the crop scouting, and helping producers make decisions about pest management. So as a pesticide applicator, you might not ever be involved in the scouting process, but just know that it does play a major role. And as you're somebody who's out there in the field, if you notice something weird, use that cell phone. If you can, take some pictures, share that information because it might help your producers out. Um, but yeah, knowing what pests are present and the level of infestation, the growth stage of the pest and of the crop. If you've got any natural enemies present, there's any diseases out there, if your populations are going up or down, the general physical conditions of the field, and then making sure that you're writing all this down for reference later. I know pesticide applicators, you guys have to keep records of your applications. For producers, though, it can be a really good idea to be keeping records of your crop progress. I encourage home gardeners to do the same thing because it can be handy to remember, like, oh yeah, I grew this variety this year and it worked really well, or I grew this and like the squirrels just ate all of it. So keeping records, super important. And for pesticide applicators, probably also part of your state laws. So your scouting can be passive or active. So if you're out in a field and you notice maybe some of those yellow sticky cards, like I have pictured here, those are for monitoring, critter levels in a field. They're pretty non-selective, so anything will get stuck to those yellow cards, including people. So be real careful. You always want to be like touching the non-sticky inside because that tanglefoot is intense. There can also be traps out in the field. I worked in sweet corn back in Pennsylvania, and we used those big mesh heart stack traps that would have a pheromone lure in them, and so they were very specific to certain kinds of sweet corn pests. You can also have active monitoring, so that's when you've got a person who's out there swinging a sweep net, flipping over leaves on a plant, and being sort of maybe more selective and more intensive about their sampling. But yeah, once you've got the critter captured in a net, transferring it to some sort of container, or in this case, a zip top bag, catching it in a trap, and then sort of getting those contents to stay in one spot. I end up putting a lot of things in the freezer. That's my preferred way of dispatching insects that are coming out of a sampling effort, just because you don't have to mess around with chemicals. But you can throw them in a cooler to kind of chill them out so that you can take some pictures. But yeah, having a body, having a specimen can be really important for figuring out what the pest problem is. Like if you see a weird plant in the field and you're like, oh man, I wonder, what kind of weed this is, like taking pictures of the any flowers, of the leaves, and even pulling a sample if that's something that you're allowed to do. But yeah, for identification, identifying the body, absolutely critical. I just had a phone call this morning from somebody who had an insect question, but they didn't have an insect. They just had a very uh, vague description of a small brown insect, and I'm like, I'm gonna need a body. Um, for plant damage, sort of being able to tell, if is it from an arthropod? Is it something that's abiotic? Is it a nutritional issue in the plant? Is it a lack of water? Is it a pathogen? So using your diagnostic clinic resources can be really useful. And as an entomologist, I feel like I'm a little bit of an evangelist for insects, but just because an insect's on a plant doesn't mean that it's necessarily causing any damage. You can see on the left here, I do have a picture of a cute little bee hanging out on an unripe tomato. Clearly, that bee is just having a good time, not doing any damage. However, that grasshopper on the right probably was munching on the kale a little bit. I know we have massive grasshopper issues in South Dakota some years. Those guys are usually guilty. But yeah, identifying the body or the plant or the disease will get you to better management or no management. There are some times where you pick something up and you're like, oh man, is this going to be a problem? And turns out it's just something that exists out there and it isn't one of our on our list of usual suspects for being a pest. But especially with insects, identifying the life stage can be really important because the larvae or nymphs can be very different from their adults. So if you think about butterflies, using the monarch butterfly as an example, because that's the most charismatic of the mini fauna, but the adults nectar on pretty much any flower. They do enjoy milkweeds some of the open sunflowers, but they'll nectar wherever they can get it. However, their caterpillars are very specific and are only going to be eating milkweed. If you think about some of our, say, like soybean pests, I know out here in South Dakota, we've got the thistle caterpillar, which is actually the caterpillar of the painted lady butterfly. And that guy loves soybeans. So there have been some years that we end up with a bunch of thistle caterpillars in soybeans. And then by the time we get to September, we've got a cloud of painted lady butterflies. So yeah, so for insects, knowing your life stage or getting the sample to somebody who can tell you the life stage is important. Like you don't have to be the expert in anything in everything, but if you know your resources, you can get a lot of good information that way. And then also on the disease side, like bacteria, viruses, fungi have very different treatments. If you're putting an antibacterial out there on something that's actually a fungus, like it's not going to do anything. But yeah, use your resources and experts that you have in the state of Montana to help you get to some of this information. And you can help them help you by capturing a usable image if you are taking pictures of a critter or a flower or a plant or whatever. But making sure that your picture is in focus, one of the biggest ones, super helps to have the subject in focus. With insects, if it's something that you don't want to kill, but you want to take a good picture, pop it in the fridge for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and that will chill it out enough that you can get some good pictures and allow it to fly off. So if you're somebody you're like, oh man, I see this really cool bee, you can chill out the bee, take a picture, and then let it go. You absolutely get bonus points if you can show scale. So clearly, this one's not in focus, but they did good work and put a pencil next to it so we could see the size of the critter. So having a scale, like a little like ruler as part of your field kit, whatever, very helpful. Because sometimes with no reference material, you have no idea how big something is. This is an example of in focus and showing scale. So we've got these tiny little millipedes next to a quarter. Quarter's really handy because millipedes, like I've seen ones that are like this big. Those tend to be a tropical species that are kept in captivity, but still, without that quarter, wouldn't quite know what I was dealing with. And then get as close as you can to the critter. That gives us sort of the best shot at being able to look at the photo and maybe see some of the characters that we need to see. Um, but yeah, you can submit samples for identification. Check out your local extension resources. And if you're going to mail in a sample anywhere, make sure that you use a hard-sided container. That's my like PSA as an entomologist. I've absolutely gotten envelopes like full of beetles and they just go through a mail sorter and get smushed and I end up with confetti. So use a hard-sided container, freeze the sample so that when it shows up to where it's going, it's dead on arrival. I've absolutely had things like chew their way out of containers and then be running loose in my office. Luckily, that was just carpenter ants and not like bed bugs or something. But yeah, so those are sort of all of your tips and tricks for scouting, IDing the body, how to submit a sample. For management recommendations, and again, I know not all of you out there are necessarily the people that are making those management recommendations, but it's the theory behind it. You want to be monitoring those pest populations and comparing them to existing economic thresholds and economic injury levels. So I'll use soybeans as an example because I spent a lot of time with soybean aphid back in the early 2000s. But the economic threshold for soybean aphids is 250 aphids per plant. There's a couple different scouting methods for those guys. There's a speed scout that's pretty great. Um, but if you're scouting and your, say, soybean aphids are under 250 per plant, you can just let them ride, go back and resample in a couple days. The thing with those economic thresholds, that's the point where above that threshold, it makes sense economically to use the treatment method. Whereas underneath that threshold, the cost of that treatment or application is going to be more than whatever return on yield you would be getting by treating that critter. So we're trying to keep our pests below those economic injury levels. And we're doing that using multiple management strategies. No one of these is successful on its own, but together they can hopefully help you get to a level of pest issues that's manageable for your operation. We've got cultural and physical controls. And so these are things that are like, selecting resistant cultivars, things that start sort of at the plant selection part of the process. We have biological controls, so those are things like other critters. Mechanical control, so something like tillage would be an example of mechanical control. And then obviously chemical control, which is where a lot of you come into this system, is using pesticides. And just a note for folks out there that organic pesticides are still pesticides. They still have a label, they still have safety restrictions, there's still things that you have to do when using them. Just because it's organic does not mean that it is without risk. And I should have fixed this, making sure that you have the appropriate Montana pesticide license and certification. But yeah, some of these multiple management strategies, for biological control, you can encourage natural enemies. So that's why, when you're out there scouting, not every insect you see is going to be a pest. You're obviously going to be seeing pollinators out there, but also things like lady beetles, and some other predators. Cultural management, like I said, choosing resistant varieties, cover crops can be in there, the actual crop rotation. So a lot of these things are stuff that, people are already doing. They might not just be thinking about it as being part of integrated pest management. And then chemical management, sometimes you end up using chemicals prophylactically, so as a preventative, um, or as a curative. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. But yeah, resistant varieties can help out a whole bunch for things like diseases. Um, Changing planting time can help you sort of move away from when a pest is present. Although in some of these more northern states that we're living in, you can run into issues with, do you have enough time for the crop to actually finish production? So that can be tricky. Working in Pennsylvania, we could grow pretty much everything except for citrus. It was wild, um, and had a very long growing season, sort of compared to where I am now in South Dakota. And then there are some things that can be treated preventatively with chemicals. A lot of times those are thinking about like some disease issues, especially in like fruit crop production, like tree fruits, where you need to put the fungicide out there before the fungus is present so that it prevents the fungus from entering the plant. A lot of times when we're dealing with insecticides, those are definitely curative. We're spraying something over the top of the plant, and that's killing anything that it runs into or maybe consumes it. Climate and weather monitoring is really important, especially if you are trying to mitigate drift issues and off-target movement from things volatilizing. You can also use phenology, which is like looking at how many degree days does it take for a thing to happen. You can use that to help inform management decisions as well. But I did look it up, and Montana has a mesonet. South Dakota has one too. So I was like, I bet Montana has one. But the mesonet have really detailed weather stations across the state. I'll show you an example here. You can check out the webcam. You've got like four different views on the webcam. It'll give you like air temperature. You've got like precipitation, soil temperature, snow depth. These networks are really impressive, honestly. And there were a ton. I mean, Montana's a big state, so I'm sure whoever is in charge of your Mesonet probably wants even more stations. I know that's the way South Dakota is. We're trying to get it so that everyone in South Dakota is within 60 miles of a Mesonet station. But um, really useful information. They also include a section with ag tools. I know we've got a like a spray drift calculator. So this is another resource that if you haven't been utilizing it, definitely go check it out, especially in the off season. See how it might be able to help you with your record keeping and with making better applications. And then going through all that, you do want to assess the effect of your IPM program. You also want to make sure you're assessing the effect of any chemical application. So if you're the person out there doing the application, hopefully someone else is coming in behind you, a couple of days later to make sure that, whatever it was is actually dead. Because if it's not, that's when you know you might have a resistance issue. And that is like a whole other 50-minute talk. But yeah, you want to know if your management strategy worked. If it did, yay, the cycle continues, keep scouting. If it didn't work, that's when you need to maybe, try a different management strategy, like throw a different chemical out there, change your timing, double check your identification. But yeah, always make sure that you're going back and seeing how things did. So that's why it's a cycle and not just a checklist. So, what to do with pesticides? Make sure that you're using them according to their label directions. Can't say that enough. Read and follow those label directions. Store them according to their label directions. If they get improperly stored, extreme temperature changes, all that, they can lose their efficacy or even become unusable. Always make sure that they're in their original containers. Do not decant things into other containers that do not have that label. That is a bad deal, and how you end up maybe spraying an herbicide when you meant to spray an insecticide. Um, we had a case in South Dakota where a lawn care company mixed up I think it was their fertilizers and their herbicides, and ended up nuking a bunch of yards with herbicide when they thought they were doing a fertilizer treatment. So make sure those products are staying with their original label. And then make sure that you're disposing of any unused or unusable pesticides according to your local requirements. And that's the same deal with empty containers. We do pesticide container recycling here in South Dakota. So hopefully you guys in Montana have access to a similar program. But yeah, for folks that are looking to solve your pest problems, decide how much damage you can tolerate, make sure you're identifying the problem, starting with the least toxic control and then moving up if needed, making sure you're reading and following that product label, and then making sure you're also wearing your proper protective clothing and following those safety protocols. So we want folks to be staying safe out there so that you can continue, so you can make it through the season, enjoy your life outside of the pesticide applicator rig. But yeah, coming back to pollinators, pollinators and pesticides absolutely have to coexist. Hopefully, I've shared some tools with you guys that will help to foster communication between the stakeholders here, between our applicators, between our producers, and then, anything that folks can do to, demonstrate best management practices on both sides of the equation can be really helpful, especially for helping to sway public opinion and for public education. So, and I included a cute little picture here of one of my favorite pollinators that's not a bee. This is actually a bee fly. So it's a fly, not a bee. Bee is in the name. They're very cute. But yeah, folks have questions, throw those in the Q&A. I'm going to put my contact information up here, and then I will check out the Q&A box. Doesn't look like we have any questions so far, so that's super nice. I see there's 87 messages in the chat. I'm hoping a lot of those are people just, confirming their attendance because if there are questions there, I don't know that I'm going to be able to find them. But yeah, I'm out here in Pierre, South Dakota, so right in the middle of the state, and then my email address is up there. If you want to shoot me an email about anything, feel free. Just make sure you get those two N's, otherwise I will never see it. But yeah, it was great sharing information with you folks in Montana. And again, hopefully I will be able to get to Montana at some point. I was in Wyoming this year, just didn't go farther west. Oh, Beth, I can see that you're talking, but I can't hear you weirdly. No, it's like you're not muted, but I'm guessing your audio input maybe did something weird. Nope.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
There was not a question, but it was a thank you in the Q&A box. So just to follow up on one thing you mentioned, the Bumblebee Atlas, I did check and somebody mentioned this in the chat that yes, Montana does have a Bumblebee Atlas. And
Awesome.
looks like in the same group with Utah, Wyoming, Nevada, and Colorado. And but there is a specific one for Montana. So that's a new tool for me. I was not aware of that. So thank you for sharing all the great tools.
Yeah, the Bumblebee Atlas is also really fun if you're somebody who wants to be involved in community science or just likes to go, you got some land and you like to go hike around, you can actually sign up to like adopt a grid cell and do a bumblebee survey for the atlas and submit, pictures and data that way. So if you want to get really into bumblebees, there's some deep dives out there for you.
Great. There is one question. Okay, looks like there is a question. Um,
The Beehive website, that was probably so FieldWatch does have the apiaries listed, but oh, that might be the Montana website that I pulled up. Let me, it was the Montana plants apiary search. And I will type that answer in there. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Amanda. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. And thanks to everybody who tuned in. And hopefully you learned about some new tools and you have Amanda's contact information. And we appreciate you taking time to join us.
All right, yeah, thank you guys for having me. Delightful to talk to Montana at a distance, and hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your winter.
Thank you, Amanda. And the invitation's open to come visit too.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.